Welcome to Empire Economics, where we uncover the stories of money, power, and the forces that shape civilizations. In 1929, America thought it had unlocked endless prosperity. Stocks soared, factories roared, and the future looked unstoppable. Then, almost overnight, everything collapsed. Banks failed. Fortunes vanished. Families stood in breadlines. What caused the wealthiest nation on earth to fall apart so fast? And could those same mistakes be repeating today? Before we begin, hit subscribe, because understanding what happened back then might be the only way to see what's coming next. Now, let's go back to the moment the celebration ended and the Great Depression began. Have you ever wondered how an entire country can go from celebrating prosperity to standing in breadlines almost overnight? Picture this. It's 1929, and America is throwing the biggest party in its history. People are getting rich buying stocks, cars are rolling off assembly lines, and everyone believes the good times will last forever. Then, in a matter of days, everything changes. Banks close their doors, factories shut down, millions lose their jobs, and suddenly, the wealthiest nation on earth becomes a place where families build homes out of cardboard boxes. This isn't just ancient history. This is the story of the Great Depression, and understanding how it happened reveals patterns that repeat throughout economic history. The lessons from this catastrophe aren't just about the past. They're about recognizing the warning signs that economies ignore at their peril. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. The Great Depression wasn't caused by one single event. It was the result of multiple economic mistakes and vulnerabilities that built up over years, creating a perfect storm that devastated an entire generation. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how this happened, breaking down complex economic forces into simple terms that anyone can understand. And here's why this matters more than you might think. The same patterns that destroyed wealth in the 1930s have appeared throughout history, from ancient Rome to modern financial crises. By the end of this explanation, you'll understand not just what happened during the Great Depression, but how to recognize the warning signs that similar disasters leave behind. Let's start with the foundation that made everything possible, the Roaring Twenties. Throughout the 1920s, America experienced unprecedented economic growth. Industrial production soared, new technologies emerged, and consumers embraced a lifestyle built on credit and consumption. But beneath this glittering surface, dangerous cracks were forming. The first crack was extreme wealth inequality. By 1928, the top 1% of Americans earned nearly 30% of the nation's total income. This created a fundamental problem. Most people didn't have enough purchasing power to sustain the economic growth that the wealthy were celebrating. When a tiny fraction of the population controls most of the money, the economy becomes dangerously dependent on their spending and investment decisions. The second crack was reckless lending practices. Banks operated under minimal regulation, making loans to anyone who wanted them. This wasn't just poor judgment. It was a systematic failure that would prove catastrophic when economic conditions changed. Banks counted on continuous growth to justify their risky lending. But growth built on borrowed money is always fragile. The third crack was speculation fever. During the 1920s, buying stocks became a national obsession. But here's the dangerous part. People weren't investing with their own money. They were buying stocks on margin, which meant paying only 10% of a stock's price up front and borrowing the rest from banks. This created an brokers or artificial demand that drove stock prices far beyond their real value. Think of it like this. Imagine if everyone in your neighborhood decided to buy houses by putting down only 10% and borrowing the rest, driving home prices through the roof. Then imagine what happens when people can't make their loan payments and everyone tries to sell at once. That's essentially what happened to the entire American stock market. By 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had increased sixfold since 1921, reaching heights that had no connection to the actual value of the companies being traded. Experienced investors began to recognize that prices couldn't continue rising forever. When they started selling their shares, it triggered a chain reaction that would change everything. The crash began on October 24, 1929, known as Black Thursday, when a record-breaking 12.9 million shares were traded as panic selling took hold. But the worst was yet to come. 5 days later, on October 29th, Black Tuesday arrived with a vengeance. More than 16 million shares changed hands in a single day as stock prices collapsed completely. The slide continued relentlessly. By the summer of 1932, the Dow had fallen to just 41 points, representing an 89% decline from its peak. Billions of dollars in wealth simply vanished. Investors who had been millionaires on paper found themselves bankrupt. The stock market wouldn't recover to its pre-crash levels for 25 years. But here's the crucial point that many people miss. The stock market crash alone didn't cause the Great Depression. Even economists agree that while the crash was devastating, it wasn't big enough by itself to create the decade-long economic catastrophe that followed. Without the crash, America would have experienced a severe recession, but not the complete economic collapse that defined the 1930s. The real disaster came from what happened next. Fear and uncertainty swept across the nation like wildfire. When people watched their neighbors lose everything in the stock market, they didn't just worry about their investments. They worried about their jobs, their savings, and whether they could pay their bills next month. This psychological shift triggered a chain reaction that transformed a stock market crash into an economic catastrophe. Consumers stopped buying. Why purchase a new car or furniture when you might lose your job tomorrow? This sudden drop in spending meant factories had to cut production. With less production came fewer jobs. With fewer jobs came even less spending. The economy entered a vicious downward spiral where each problem made every other problem worse. But the most devastating blow came from the banking system itself. Between 1929 and 1933, over 7,000 banks failed across America. That's not a typo. 7,000 financial institutions collapsed, taking the life savings of millions of ordinary families with them. To put this in perspective, recent financial crises have seen dozens of bank failures, not thousands. Here's how the banking crisis unfolded. Banks in the 1920s operated on a simple principle. They kept only a small percentage of depositors' money in their vaults and lent out the rest to earn profits. This system works perfectly fine as long as people trust their banks and don't all demand their money back at the same time. But when panic strikes, this system becomes a death trap. The crisis began in November 1930 with the collapse of Caldwell and Company, the largest bank holding company in the South. Word spread that banks were in trouble and people rushed to withdraw their savings before it was too late. But banks didn't have enough cash on hand to meet this sudden demand. When customers lined up outside bank doors only to find them locked, panic spread to other banks in the same town, then to neighboring cities, then across entire states. This created what economists call bank runs, where perfectly healthy banks could be destroyed in a matter of hours simply because people feared they might fail. Fear became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Even banks that had made sound investments and responsible loans couldn't survive when thousands of depositors demanded their money simultaneously. The Federal Reserve, which was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of crisis, stood by and watched it happen. Instead of injecting money into the banking system to stop the panic, they remained passive as 1/3 of all American banks vanished from existence. This wasn't just a policy mistake. It was a catastrophic failure that turned a normal recession into what economists now call the Great Contraction. As banks failed, the money supply shrank by more than 30% between 1929 and 1932. Think about what this means in practical terms. With one-third less money circulating through the economy, prices fell dramatically. While falling prices might sound good, deflation creates its own nightmare. When people expect prices to drop further, they delay purchases, which reduces demand, which forces prices even lower. Businesses found themselves trapped. They owed the same amount on their loans, but their products were worth less and less each month. Many companies that survived the stock market crash couldn't survive the deflationary spiral that followed. Factories closed, unemployment soared, and entire communities were devastated. By the time Franklin Roosevelt took office in 1933, unemployment had reached 25%. Industrial production had fallen by nearly half, and the banking system had completely collapsed. The Great Depression wasn't just one mistake. It was wealth inequality, reckless speculation, banking failures, and policy errors, all colliding at once. The patterns that destroyed an entire generation's prosperity didn't disappear in the 1930s. They resurface whenever societies forget that sustainable economies require more than endless optimism and borrowed money. Understanding this history isn't about predicting doom. It's about recognizing that financial stability comes from learning these lessons before they repeat. If this opened your eyes to how economic disasters unfold, hit subscribe. History teaches us what to watch for. This content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute financial, legal, or investment advice.